How's it going, AP Euro? This is Mr. Lamb. This will be the first of the lectures, the video lectures that I'll be doing for you. The good news for y'all, though, is that we're not going to have many of these video lectures because we are almost done with the content that will be on your AP exams due to the changes that AP has made. We've gone over all of those, so I'm not going to get too far into that. But this lecture will cover African imperialism, and then next week you guys will get a lecture on the Asian imperialism, the imperialism that occurred in Asia. And then we'll kind of wrap up and we'll begin our review process. So how this is going to work, I'm going to post this video to YouTube, post a link to Google Classroom. You guys are going to watch the video, and as you watch the video, you're going to fill out the questions that I've made for you that come directly from the video. Okay, so to get the questions right, you need to watch the video. I know it's not the greatest video in the world. I'm not like a cameraman or anything. I know it's not the greatest quality in the world, but it is what we got to do for right now. Those questions, every assignment that you get, you'll get an assignment every Monday and every Wednesday. They'll be due by the beginning of the next class. Okay, they're due by the beginning of the next class. So this will be due next Monday. All right, so let's go ahead and get right into this. The first thing we need to do is review the old imperialism. That is the imperialism that occurred in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, mainly perpetrated by those powerful monarchies of Spain, England, France, and to a lesser extent the Republic of the Netherlands. However, we need to talk about what makes the two imperialisms similar and what makes them different. Now, there's going to be a lot of similarities, but there's also some huge differences. The main one being that the old imperialism wasn't really about conquest. Now, this may be confusing because the main part of that old imperialism that we usually talk about is the conquest of the New World, which was about conquest. However, for Africa and Asia, there was almost no conquest by Europeans. It just didn't happen. There are a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, Europe didn't have the technology yet to conquer vast amounts of territory and people. Remember, Europe was able to conquer the New World, but they were helped out by smallpox, which did 90% of the work for them. In Africa and Asia, they did not have the ability to do that. In Africa, it had mainly to do that there was this disease present in the interior of Africa called malaria, to which Europeans had no immunity for. So they literally couldn't even go into the interior of Africa to try to do that. In Asia, Asia was where gunpowder was invented, and so most of the folks in Asia actually had the same weapons that the Europeans did. Now, the Europeans had better naval technology, which is why they were able to set up these trading posts like Hong Kong and Macau, and Europeans were able to take over that way. However, they weren't able to conquer empires like the Ming Dynasty, or the Qing Dynasty or the Mughal Dynasty, simply because they didn't have the technology yet. And it's not until they start developing those bigger technologies that they're able to do that. So as we move forward, we need to talk about the motivations for the old imperialism. We remember that by the very easy to remember 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. We're going to talk about those in level of importance. The first one is the economic motivations. The most important motivation for why Europeans started to explore is the desire to find a direct trade route with Asia. Remember, during the Renaissance, Italy and the Italian states become super, super rich because they become the middleman between the Asian markets that produce the Asian goods and Western Europe. Well, that leads the Western Europes to go, we have to find a way to get around these middlemen and get directly to Asia ourselves. And that is why Portugal is the first country to start exploring. Spain is the second, and then France, England, and the Netherlands are just going to join in. That is because they are desperate to find a way to get to Asia. The second very important part of this is mercantilism. Now, mercantilism can be very confusing, but let's break it down as simple as we can for the context that we're in. The idea of mercantilism is that you have to have a positive balance of trade, meaning you have to export more goods than you import because that's how you make money. Okay, it is the complete denial of free trade. It's the opposite of free trade. What they believed was that for a colony like England to make money, they had to make more money than Spain. And to do that, England had to produce more goods and sell more goods than the Spanish did. And the best way for them to do that was to get raw materials and raw resources from the colonies, bring those to England, manufacture good, and then sell those goods back to the colonies. That way they don't have to import anything from Spain or France or any place like that. In doing so, they could create a positive balance of trade, which would give them the economic advantage. We're pre-capitalism here. We're pre-free trade. The next thing we have is the emergence of the cash crop economy. These are things like sugar, coffee, cotton, indigo, rice. Those raw resources that become huge commodities in Europe can only be grown in certain parts of the world in colonies. Coffee really can only be grown in places like Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, those places in South America, whereas sugar has to be grown in tropical areas. Cotton needs particularly fertile soil that can be found in the southeastern United States. So those resources become more and more important. And of course, as they become more important, so do slaves and the Atlantic slave trade. The last thing is commercialization. We know that the commercial revolution is taking place at the exact time. Subsistence living and the barter system are going out, and we're now getting into a more modern commercialization where it is all about buying and selling goods, and that is just going to make colonies much more valuable. The political reason is very simple. It's rivalries. It's the rivalries between the different powers. Spain had a huge rivalry with England that defined the 1500s. England and France had a rivalry that went back 1,000 years, but really helped define the 1700s. And those rivalries between different countries are going to just push them farther into conquest. And of course, then we have the religious aspect. Of course, the desire to Christianize all these native peoples, specifically in the New World, but also in Africa and Asia. And then the rivalry between the newfound Protestants, because remember the Reformation is going on at the same time as all this, and the Catholics who are in their counter-Reformation. They are competing with each other for the souls of the new people. Let's now start to talk about the new imperialism. That is the imperialism that's going to start in the late 19th century. So to put this in perspective, in 1800, Europe controlled about 7% of the world's population. By 1914, 84% of the world's population will live under a European flag, European rule of some sort. The British Empire alone controls 25% of the population in the year 1900s. And this imperialism is going to be much different because it's all going to be about conquest and domination. Europeans use their military power and technology to impose European rule by force. They overwhelmingly do this because of the economic concerns. They want to take over that country, exploit their resources to benefit the European industrial economy. Now, there is a cultural side. They're going to try to impose European values on the areas they conquer, but that is by far does not compare to the importance of the economic causes. So let's get into those causes right now. We're going to divide these up into 4 ways: economic, political, social, and technological. These are the 4 causes of European imperialism. When we start with economic, of course, economic is going to be the primary cause. It's all about industrialization. Okay, we're no longer in mercantilism. We're no longer in that economic theory. We've now moved on to a more capitalistic global trade. However, now you have all these countries who are now competing at an industrial level. And in industry, the most important thing you need is resources. Okay. And now we're not just talking about those cash crops, we're talking about raw resources, specifically things like oil, coal, even mining things like gold, silver, diamond, all those raw materials which Africa was rich in. Asia's a little bit different because they have more things more like spice, and they're more interested in the markets. And that brings us to our second point, which is they wanted new markets to sell their goods. Now, with industrialization, you have mass production. So you have European industry, which is mass producing these goods, and there just aren't enough Europeans to buy those goods. So they're going to conquer these other territories and then sell those goods to the new territories in Africa and Asia. Now, as we're going to see, in Africa, this is not going to be successful because the African population is never going to have enough money to actually buy European goods at a massive level. However, there are a lot of people in Asia. It's the most populous continent by a large margin. That's going to be the main reason for Asian imperialism, which we'll get to next week. All right, other raw resources that they're going to be after are things that are only available in specific regions. Things like ivory, rubber, diamonds, tea, cocoa, cotton, and spices. When we get into the political reasons, we actually see a continuity between the old imperialism and the new imperialism. That mainly being that the old imperialism, the political factors usually had to do with rivalries between countries. We've got the same thing going on here. Specifically, rivalries between the old imperial powers of Britain and France and the new imperial powers of Germany, Italy, and Russia. All countries wanted to build naval bases throughout the world as well, because to control a global empire, you needed naval bases. To have naval bases, you needed to take over islands and coastal regions. And so you're going to see a competition between the naval countries of Europe. Now, it's important to know that imperialism itself is not going to start a war, but it is going to be a powerful factor in the start of World War I. Then we have our social reasons. Now, religion is still there, obviously, and there are people, specifically in the middle class, which is becoming more religious, who are motivated to support imperialism because they want to support religion. It should be noted that the religious cause isn't actually very successful, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa. The part of Africa below the Saharan desert actually does become mainly Christian. However, in the Muslim-dominated north of Africa and the very religiously diverse Asia, Christianity is never really going to take a hold. But the biggest factor as far as social that I want to talk about is social Darwinism. Now, we remember social Darwinism as taking that idea of survival of the fittest and applying it to humanity. So social Darwinism is the idea that because Europe was more prosperous than all these other continents, that was evidence that the Europeans were simply better than Africans and Asians. Because Europe had better technology, that was proof that Europeans were smarter and racially superior than all these other groups. And that since they were superior, it was not just their right to take over these other countries, but it was their responsibility to take over these other countries. This is what we call literally the white man's burden. Okay, this is a racist and patronizing view of the world that says superior Westerners had a responsibility to take over the uncivilized and barbaric East and impose Western values on those people. It's famously, it was came up by this guy named Rudyard Kipling, who wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden. I'm going to briefly read this poem here. It says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples half devil and half child. take up the white man's burden and patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple and 100 times made plain. What that is essentially saying is that it is the responsibility of these well bred Europeans to go to Africa and Asia and civilize these barbaric folk. So, the last motivation that we're going to talk about is technological. Two types of technologies. One is medical, the other is military. Quinine is the vaccine for malaria. As I said earlier, you cannot get into Africa without encountering malaria. It's very prevalent due to the amount of mosquitoes in Africa. Europeans had no immunity to that prior to the invention of quinine. So with the invention of quinine, Europe can move into Africa on a massive scale. The other is a military technologies. There's a lot. Steamships, very important, allows them to go up and down rivers. Mini balls are very accurate bullets. But the main one that I want to talk about is the Gatling gun or the machine gun, which there's just no way for the African natives to compete when European armies were armed with machine guns. So I've put a couple maps on the screen here just to show you guys just how effective the scramble for Africa was. As you can see in this first map, there's almost no European presence on the African continent in 1880. There's a small French outpost in Algeria. They control some amount of Algeria, and then you can see the British Cape Colony in the south. However, other than that, really not any European presence. Now let's look at what Africa looks like in 1914. And as you can see, essentially the entire colony has been taken over by Europeans. You see a large British presence, large French presence, the Germans are there. Only Ethiopia and Liberia are able to avoid it. So that's how much change we're talking about. In 35 years, Europe takes over an entire continent. So what we're going to talk about first is the scramble for Africa. And what this was a period between the years 1880 and 1914 where the Europeans are going to conquer essentially the entire continent of Africa, as we just saw from those two maps. We're going to talk about four different European empires within Africa. The first one we're going to talk about are the Belgians. Now, Belgium is not a very important country. However, they are going to be the ones who kind of start everything. And their conquest of a region called the Congo is going to become infamous for its brutality and its many atrocities. What happened was the king of Belgium, a man by the name of Leopold II, had a ton of money. He didn't actually have that much power. What he had was a lot of money, and he hired a man by the name of H.M. Stanley, an American explorer, to go into the region known as the Congo, make deals with different local tribe leaders, and establish trading posts throughout the region. Once that had been done, he sent in what were essentially mercenary troops to literally conquer the region, but in the name of Leopold II. So Belgium, the Belgian government, didn't actually have any control over the Congo. It was the personal property of Leopold II, and he used this personal property to enrich himself further. The Congo, turns out, has a ton of rubber trees. And so rubber is going to be the main thing that they were looking. To get this rubber, they essentially enslave the local population. Now, they don't do this through the slavery that we think of when we think of the American context. They do this by going into individual villages, taking all the women and children hostage, and then forcing the men to go into the forest where the rubber trees were and having quotas for those men to get. And the brutality at which this was enforced, first off, the hostages, but also just how long it goes on. It goes on for 20 years before anyone even blinks at it. The punishment for villages who couldn't come up with their quota of rubber was often the death of the hostages, or infamously, they would cut off some of the hands of the workers, of the African people. The overall effect on the entire colony of the Congo was devastating. Over 50% of the population ends up dying because since they were spending so much time getting rubber, they weren't actually growing food, so a famine breaks out. And even beyond that, the Belgian masters or the mercenaries working for Leopold II were brutal and murdered people at a very impressive rate. And so I've actually attached a video to go further into this, and it's really good. It's about 9 minutes long, and it gets into the exact atrocities that this committed, as well as their effect on the Congolese people. So before we move on to talking about the British, we're going to talk really quick about what's called the Berlin Conference. And this was a conference that happened in 1884 in Berlin, led by Otto von Bismarck, to try to ensure that the balance of power could remain intact despite all this acquisition of new territory. So one of the big problems that Europe was facing was that if everyone is scrambling to gain territory in Africa, eventually two people are going to want the same territory and a war is going to break out. No one wants to fight a war over Africa. So they end up essentially redrawing the map. They come up with the rules of colonization. The first and pretty much the only rule that you cannot claim a territory unless you already have military control of said territory. And that actually increases the military presence because after that, European powers are essentially going to send in their entire militaries to try to control these places so that they can get control of those territories. And then once a country controls a territory, it is their sovereign territory, so you can no longer infringe on it. I want to note two things about the Berlin Conference. Firstly, that no Africans were consulted in the making of these maps. And that's important because the Europeans did this with no African considerations. They didn't consider what tribes lived where. They didn't consider language groups. They didn't consider tribal rivalries. They didn't consider who was related to who. And so it really just throws the African map into a conglomerate of European borders that don't actually make sense for the Africans who live there. Now we're going to talk about the largest empire in Africa, the British Empire. By this point, the British were the most powerful country in the world. They're going to start expanding in Africa, and the first place they're going to go to is Egypt. Now, Egypt was important for a number of reasons. Technically, Egypt belonged to the Ottoman Empire. However, because the Ottoman Empire had become so weak, Egypt, under the leadership of a man named Muhammad Ali, had managed to essentially gain autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. But in Egypt, with the help of French and English engineers, they end up building what's called the Suez Canal. What the Suez Canal does is it literally connects the Mediterranean Sea through to the Red Sea and eventually gets to the Indian Ocean. And what it did was it cut the time that it took to get from London to Mumbai, at that point the capital of British India, in half. So it was incredibly important to the British to be able to control the Suez Canal, and that is going to be their main motivation for getting involved in Egypt. Now, what the British do is they essentially get the Egyptian leadership on their side. They do this by bribery, but also by threats. By 1883, Britain has made Egypt a protectorate. Literally, they're just saying, this is the area, we're protecting it. If you infringe on Egypt, you infringe on us, the British. However, they're not actually protecting anyone except their own interest. The Egyptians don't want British protection, and they're not getting British protection because what the British do is they say, in order to protect Egypt, we have to move thousands and thousands of troops into Egypt to protect it. But really, by 1883, Britain is in full control over Egypt and the Suez Canal. Now, the other very important colony to talk about in regards to Britain is South Africa, or the colony that will eventually become South Africa. South Africa has a very interesting history. In the 1600s, a group of Dutch settlers ended up settling in what was called the Cape Colony. That is literally the bottom part of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. These Dutch settlers became overwhelmingly farmers, and so they are often called the Boers, Boer being Dutch for farmer. These farmers were not very rich. They were mainly small communities, very isolated from one another, but they had European weapons so they could defend off native attacks. And in a lot of cases, they could actually enslave native peoples and sell those on the markets to make themselves more money. However, eventually the British show up. They start taking over a lot of territory. The Boers and the British did not get along, mainly because the British tended to make friendly treaties with a lot of the native African tribes. Now, those treaties have obviously favored the British, and they actually get rid of the slave trade, which the Boers had come to rely on. So the Boers decide they're going to leave the Cape Colony and they're going to move north and they establish what are called the Boer republics. These are little republics north of the British Cape Colony that are run by the Boers, these Dutch speaking African born Europeans. However, at first it's live and let live. Okay, if these crazy farmers want to go up there and they want to live by themselves, whatever. Then diamonds and gold are discovered in Boer territory. And nothing will bring the British to your land faster than diamonds and gold. The British effort is led by a man named Cecil Rhodes. And of all the people who are synonymous with imperialism and social Darwinism, Cecil Rhodes is probably the most. He was a very large, rambunctious, obnoxious, super wealthy, British-born, South African-born Brit. And he famously went to Oxford and established what's called the Rhodes Scholarship, which still exists today. But he was an imperialist, and he was such an imperialist that he kind of took social Darwinism to the next level, because he didn't just say that white people are superior to non-white people. He said that British people are the most superior of the white people. He even went as far as to say that Britain should reconquer the United States and have more dominion over Canada and Australia and all those places. But he says we need to invade the Boer territories in order to get these resources, these diamonds. And he famously starts the De Boers Diamond Company, which is, if you ever see the movie Blood Diamond, De Boers has a lot to do with that. He starts the first Boer War. Now, the Boers, despite the fact that they were a bunch of farmers, they were a bunch of well-armed and well-equipped farmers. And so the Boers, when the British show up, remember the British have been able to sort of dominate the local population because of their technological advantage, but the Boers were European, and they had European weapons. So when the British show up in very small numbers, they're actually defeated in the First Boer War by the Boers. And by this point, the Boers aren't really calling themselves Boers. They called themselves Afrikaners, which is literally Dutch for African. And so they calling themselves the African because they believe that that was their land. They were Africans. Anyway, this leads to two more Boer Wars. But by 1910, using overwhelming force, the Boers are eventually defeated, and South Africa becomes the Union of South Africa, where they take all these Boer republics, combine it with the British Cape Colony, and that becomes the Union of South Africa. And in this Union of South Africa, you have about 15% of the population, which is either English or Boer, Dutch, Afrikaner, and the rest of the population, which is Native African. And eventually that white population are going to vault themselves to controlling that society, and that's what eventually leads to apartheid. To wrap up the British Empire, there was a couple other places where the British were involved. They took over the Sudan, and I only mentioned the British takeover of Sudan because of one battle, and it's called the Battle of Omdurman. The Battle of Omdurman. And in that battle, the British killed 11,000 Sudanese warriors while only losing 28 British soldiers. Why? Because the British had a machine gun and the Sudanese did not. And so that just shows you that that technological advantage was what was giving Europe such a leg up over the native Africans. I'm going to finish up by talking about the French, the Germans, and the Italians. Now, the French, by territorial, actually have the largest empire. Now, that's a little bit misleading because a very big portion of their empire was actually the Saharan Desert, when that doesn't really count. However, the French are going to have a lot of control over some very valuable provinces, specifically in the north part of Africa. Their most valuable province is called Algeria. Algeria. Now, they had actually been in control of Algeria from about 1830, but they've only really controlled the part near the coast. After 1830, they're able to move down and control the entire country of Algeria. They also go take over Tunisia and Morocco, those other two North African Muslim countries. And both of those countries, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, are very francophone in nature. If you go to those countries today, you'll see a lot of evidence that the French were there. Algeria actually ends up gaining independence from the French in 1960 in a very vicious revolution against the French. So we're not going to focus too much on the French. They do have a lot of territory. However, we're going to move forward to the new players, which was the German Empire. Now, to put this in perspective, the French had been in control of Algeria since 1830. The British had taken over the Cape Colony in the early 1800s. But remember, Germany didn't become one single country until 1871. So the Germans are very, very late to the game. And this is where we have to talk about nationalism. Because as we've talked about, the driving political force here is rivalry between the various empires. And in Germany, this is a great example of nationalism being used to justify imperialism. So the Germans were, once they became a country in 1871, probably the most powerful European country. By 1890, they're the number one European economy. They have the largest industry. However, the one thing that they don't have is no matter how much better their army may be than the British army, they don't have any colonies. The British can literally say the sun never sets on the British Empire. The Germans have nothing like that. They have no colonies. And the Germans wanted to beat the British. It's that rivalry which is driven by nationalism. So during the Berlin Conference, our favorite person in the world, Otto von Bismarck, actually gets the Germans sort of into the game. Now, Germany is not going to control a whole lot of important territory, the way that the British control Egypt and South Africa, which are incredibly rich for resources. The French control a large portion of North Africa. The German provinces aren't going to be very important, but that was almost minor to what the Germans actually wanted. The Germans were in it for nationalism. They wanted respect. They wanted to be at the table with the other imperial powers, Britain and France. They're going to end up taking over Cameroon, German East Africa, a place called Togoland, which we now just call Togo, and then Southwest Africa, which is current day Namibia and part of Angola. I want to talk specifically about Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia. There was a revolution there in the 1890s where there was an uprising against German rule, and the Germans responded with absolute brutality. They ended up murdering 50,000 men, women, and children, and then burying them in these really horrifying mass graves. So again, we can see that the Germans didn't really care about the local population, just the same as every other colonial group there. The last group we want to talk about are the Italians, who are in sort of the same boat as the Germans. Italy doesn't become a united country until the 1860s, and by that point, a lot of the good colonies are taken. But that doesn't stop little Italy. They want a seat at the table. So in 1896, they try to take one of the last prizes on the board, Ethiopia. And to say it goes wrong is putting it mildly because it is a complete disaster for the Italians. They are beaten by the Ethiopians. Now, by this point, Ethiopia is a little bit different from the rest of Africa because they had a centralized government. Their government was recognized. They had an alliance with some European powers, and so they were able to get modern weapons in. But they also were able to take advantage of the geographical region of Ethiopia, which has a lot of desert, to take advantage of the Italians. And they actually become the first native African military forces to defeat European forces, which was a huge embarrassment for Italy. Now, Italy comes back in 1912 and they take Libya, a country in the North Africa, a northern African region, and then Benito Mussolini will come back in 1936 and he will actually succeed in conquering Ethiopia with the help of mustard gas. But Ethiopia does get the prize as saying they're the only African country to defeat a European conquest attempt. The only other country that was not taken over was Liberia. And now that one's a little bit complicated, but Liberia was not a colony of the United States, but they were founded by former U.S. slaves, so they had a pretty close alliance with the United States. And so most people just avoided Liberia because they didn't want to rankle the United States. Y'all, that wraps up African imperialism. So make sure you finish those questions. And for those questions, this is not a reading guide. Remember, you're turning this in. I'm going to go question by question. So answer it the best you can. Write complete sentences unless the question doesn't allow you to do so. Make sure to watch that video on the conquest of the Congo, the Belgian conquest of the Congo. Other than that, please come reach me during my office hours if you need to speak to me or ask me any questions. We will meet again on Monday to talk about Asian imperialism and everything that was going on there. Other than that, hope you guys have a great weekend and stay safe.